Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman. I'm Chris Kaufman, and today I'm talking to George Mason University Professor of Economics and New York Times bestselling author Bryan Caplan. Bryan was also the show's inaugural guest, so if you haven't already, please check out episode 1 for our previous conversation. And please forgive some of the audio quality issues in this episode. Bryan was speaking to me from Italy with a less than stellar internet connection, although everything does come through audibly in the end. Today, Bryan and I are discussing his new book, How Evil Are Politicians? Essays in Demagoguery. Bryan and I discuss cognitive biases, power hunger, FDR, we talk about Hitler and World War II, about Vietnam, and much, much more. This is my conversation with Bryan Caplan. Today I'm speaking with our first returning guest, friend of the show, Bryan Caplan. Bryan, how is Italy? How's your family? And how are you this morning?
I'm doing great today. Italy is really great, although the traffic is maybe the most horrifying I've ever seen in my life. And the hygiene of the city could be a bit better, but we are having great food. And the mountains here are some of the most amazing I've ever seen.
Beautiful. Well, I'm hoping to go to Europe in July. Probably will be in Rome for a bit of that. Your new book and your second collection of blog posts was just released. This one is called How Evil Are Politicians? Essays in Demagoguery, which is a delightfully provocative title. Can you say broadly what it's about and what connects the essays in this book together?
Demagoguery is this ancient notion of a leader who says a bunch of things that sound good but are false in order to gain power while making society worse. I think that basically describes almost all politics as it's practiced around the world, whether in democracies or dictatorships, almost regardless of who's in power. I have a lot of essays that I've written over the last 17 years related to this theme. And what I wanted to do in this book was to bring the very best of these essays together. So during those 17 years, I wrote several thousand posts. And my idea was to take about the top 5% of those and then cut them into books by books by theme. And I noticed, wow, I have a whole lot of posts about demagoguery, about politicians and how they actually operate. And this is what became the book.
You describe in one of the essays what you think a demagogue is and what precisely demagoguery is, and maybe there's more than one definition. So what is social desirability bias? It's a concept that you write about a lot, and how does it relate to demagoguery?
Social desirability bias is the psychological concept that most deserves to be discussed a lot more. It's well established in psychology, but it's not that people never talk about it, but I say it is such a powerful tool for understanding almost any area of human life, but especially politics. It's real simple. Social desirability bias just means that when the truth is ugly, people lie. And when the lies become ubiquitous enough, people start to believe absurd things. The simplest version are things like, am I fat? There's only one socially acceptable answer to, am I fat? No, of course not. You look great. That's one example, but you can also see this in things like, did you vote in the last election? Did you go to church last Sunday? If you go and compare the answers that people say to the reality, you realize, well, people are lying and in the expected direction. They're exaggerating their tendency to do the thing that is socially approved. There are lots of other examples of how this plays out. But what I say is that it's most obvious in politics. If you just listen to the way that politicians talk, the whole style of rhetoric revolves around replacing ugly truths with pretty lies. And they say this is really what demagoguery is especially about. So every time you open your mouth, say, what do people want to hear? What do they want to hear? What would sound good? And never asking yourself, really, what's actually true? What would really work? Is there anything that is relevant here that is bitter to hear, but nevertheless relevant? One very simple example of this is just think about how any politician argues in favor of a war. Have you ever heard any politician from any country say, here's a war that I think that we ought to do. There's a 50% chance it will make things better, 30% chance it will make no difference, 20% chance it will make things worse. Those are good odds. Let's proceed. No politician argues for a war in that way, which sounds like an honest argument. Instead, they'll say, as long as we work together, there will be absolute victory. We can be rest assured of this. History proves that as long as Italians work together, we always win. That's the kind of thing that a politician who wants a war says.
One of your essays, you talk a little bit about that. And you talk about how, well, if you were honest and you could say something like, we have a 50% chance of making things better, and, the odds you just gave, okay, it leans slightly in our favor. Well, no one's going to get riled up for that. And you retort, well, sure, but if that's all you have to offer, why are you so concerned to get people riled up?
It's a very simple point. Politicians, on the one hand, there's the idea of like action absolutely is essential. On the other hand, well, if I just told the truth, people wouldn't be interested. It's like, well, maybe they wouldn't be interested because if you told that the truth doesn't actually warrant the kind of aggressive action that you favor. And for a politician, you say, yes, but what good is it to me if there's no aggressive action? What's the point of power except to exercise, to do something with it, to get my way? And that's where I'm waiting to say, aha, this isn't really about fixing the world. It's about you wielding power and getting to assert your authority over humanity. And that's what I think is mostly going on in politics. So one of the main things that I talk about is the role of power hunger in politics. People very rarely talk about it. And yet, if you know human history, you realize, like, almost all of human history is leaders waging wars, trying to seize as much territory and population as they possibly can, regardless of what it does to the populations they're actually taking over. Most of human history, you see, look, it's we have one monstrous dictator, warlord after another, inflicting enormous harm so that they can be the top dog. And the question is, what do you think this motive disappeared once Western democracy showed up? The human nature suddenly changed for the first time, and now our leaders are nice people who just want to help others. That sounds almost impossible to believe. The story that makes a lot more sense is that the personality traits of politicians, their motivations, the same as ever. But in a new system, they have to pretend to have different feelings than they used to, and again, in order to gain and hold power.
Do you think that power hunger is a significantly bigger motive than something more mundane like prestige hunger or idealism?
So here's a nice way to understand why power hunger is actually what's crucial. I mean, prestige is, I would just say, just like a more general concept, say power is one kind of prestige. But the kinds of people that go into politics, they don't want just any old kind of prestige. If you said, hey, okay, you can resign from power, but you can be the world's greatest chess player, I don't think they'd be too excited about that. They want specifically political power. As to why we should think that it's prestige rather power hunger rather than idealism, here's a really strong example. It's very unusual for Supreme Court justices to resign, even when their own party is definitely in power. And if they resigned, they could go and assure there would be a similar Supreme Court justice on the bench for the next 40 years. Instead, Supreme Court justices usually serve until they die. But they don't want to relinquish what? Right? Obviously, power. So you just think you're Supreme Court justice, you're 85 years old, your party is in control, but I could resign and then I'd be replaced by someone similar to myself, but God, no, I'm not going to allow that. I'm going to just serve until I kick the bucket. And you think about it, regardless of your ideology, you think you want to be replaced by someone of similar ideology. That's what an idealist would do. If those ideals motivated you, you would say, well, it's better for the cause if I step aside. This hardly ever happens. Instead, people cling to power with both fists. And then they die, and then often this means that the other side gets it. But as long as they were alive, they got to retain power. And what's true for the Supreme Court, I think, is really true for almost all politicians. What good is our victory if I am not the instrument of victory?
Not including contemporary political figures, who do you think is a decent candidate for one of the more skilled American political demagogues?
They're top notch. But let's see. Who are some of the really good ones? So, in terms of ultimately really bad ones.
Yeah. See. You don't have to approve of their goals.
Probably the best example of an American demagogue is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's someone who really knew almost nothing about economics, right? His actual understanding of the world was poor, but his understanding of human nature and what people wanted to hear, very strong. He broke the long-standing tradition of not running after serving 2 terms in office, served for 13 years. During this time, what did he accomplish? Well, he gained the presidency when the economy was in a disastrous situation, and it really stayed in a disastrous situation, I would say, for his entire term in office. After the war, unemployment went down, but it was still a horrible situation for actual American living standards. When he gained power, what did he do? He had very little knowledge of economics. He just started trying to do things that sounded good. And so in the midst of terrible unemployment, let's go and create an aggressive trade union movement to push wages up further. Even very basic economics, look, when there's high unemployment, the last thing you want to do is to push wages up. It's a sign there's a labor surplus. Wages need to come down when there's high unemployment, but nevertheless pushes through very aggressive changes in American labor law, pushing things in the opposite direction, combined with a whole lot of feel-good slogans that people still remember to this day. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. What about aggressive economic illiteracy at the top? Do we have to fear that? Foreign policy, of course. What eventually happens is there's the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. spends 4 years fighting this terrible war. But again, people say, well, he got us out of the got us out of depression, yes, with this horrible war, which again, did eliminate unemployment in ways which again are very economically predictable, but in terms of living standards for Americans are very poor. And again, what kind of a leader is it who allows the global situation to fall to complete shambles and then says, now we need to fight a great war in order to rectify it? You think that a real leader would be someone that would have stopped problems before they became severe, not someone who served through the most horrifying war in human history and then in the end finally was able to come out on top.
I've wondered if he was in better health, if he had maintained living, would he have run for a 5th term, a 6th? Apparently his health was just horrendous.
So he died only about a year into his 4th term, so we would have had him at least until 48, so he would have gotten to have his influence in the post-war era as well.
Yeah.
And why everything in his character says he would have served for a 5th term. Sure.
You have a kind of depressing article in here, Monopolize the Pretty Lies, where you seem to question the value of telling the truth. And for such a outspoken truth teller, it made me sad, but I felt fairly convinced. Can you talk about what you mean by the pretty lies?
So here's the question. What is the point of censorship? Why does a dictator most obviously want to crush all voices of dissent? Our instinctive reaction is normally to say, well, the truth is against the dictator. The dictator knows that if people can say what's actually happening, that this will make the people turn against the dictator. And so the dictator has to go and stamp out the truth. All right. And that's not totally wrong. But if you're paying more attention to what opposition figures are saying, usually what they're saying is not all that true either. Instead, normally there is a typical bid for power, a demagogic appeal to switch power from the current leader to some new leadership. And what the demagogues say is usually false as well, right? This is easiest to see in a country like Saudi Arabia. If you wanted to take over Saudi Arabia from the House of Saud, what would you say? Would you start making a bunch of calm, reasonable claims about how, well, this is a brutal dictatorship. They are enforcing the long outmoded, if ever moded tenets of a medieval religion on an entire population. Maybe that if we were to go and replace them, we could go and raise living standards of Saudi citizens by 5%, right? Is that what you would say if you wanted to gain power? I don't think so. Instead, you would say, Allah himself despises the House of Saud. He says, give power to us. We are the ones that are anointed by Allah. Let us go and wage jihad against this House of Saud. We will hack off their heads, and then we will go and deliver a truly pure theocracy for Saudi Arabia. That's the kind of thing that you would say if you wanted to gain power in Saudi Arabia. And I say it's very similar in most countries. If you want to gain power, you don't go and give a calm, reasonable alternative to what the government is saying. Instead, you give an alternative, often even crazier story about what you would do. Why? Because if you want to win over popular support, just telling the truth doesn't sound all that good. What you want to say is to offer utopia to people, to say things are going to be great if only you give us power. Right? And the main thing that dictators are worried about is that someone else is going to start lying as ridiculously as they do and can get away with it. And that's why I say that the main thing dictators really want to do is to crush rival demagogues. So look, we and we alone get to use this kind of radioactive language, or we will have a monopoly on this because we know how dangerous it is and how potent it is. And that's why I call that chapter Monopolize the Pretty Lies. I say that what censorship is primarily about is letting the people in power be the only person that get to publicly say absurd things, and therefore the only people that are able to use this most potent rhetorical weapon for gaining and holding power.
The way you just put it is a little less sad than I had remembered it, because you're framing it like telling the truth is not useful for getting into power or for challenging the existing power structure so that you could get into power, but it might still be useful for shifting the, window of what's acceptable by, I don't know, chipping away at the acceptability of how badly they can lie.
Yeah, that's reasonable. So again, it's not that there's no value in being able to say, hey, wait a second, it was the Soviet Union, not the Nazis, who murdered all those Polish soldiers in Cotton Forest. And that was one of the long-running lies of the Soviet government. And finally, under Gorbachev, they said, sorry. It was actually us that killed all those Polish soldiers. We've been lying for all these years. And so chipping away at the lies of the regime, there's some value in that. But it's not the kind of thing that radically sways public opinion compared to just unleashing your full gut, to unleashing the full range of emotions and wild promises and claims, which is what people really do when they want to gain power. If you just think about revolutions, like how many revolutions are fought just by going and stating some obvious truths rather than by making some extravagant hyperbolic claims. Right? Like almost every revolution, you need a pile of hyperbole. That's what people know they need to do in order to win. And that's what censors know they have to crush in order to stay on top.
It's much more inspiring. You have an article where you give kind of a tongue-in-cheek advice about telling some pretty little lies, and you give four steps for how to demonize an outgroup successfully. Can you say a little bit about those?
Let's see. I'm not sure that I remember the 4 steps perfectly, but I believe it's roughly along the lines of
list as many negatives as possible was the step 1.
Yes. So if there's a group that you don't like, just start with the machine gun of negatives. Like you don't need to give numbers. Don't bother with numbers. You don't have to flesh things out a lot. Just start complaining about whatever group that you don't like. So, like if you want to demonize nerds, just say, oh yeah, well, like these nerds, like all they really like is video games, and they wear really bad glasses and they laugh funny, and just start going down that list, right? And, don't give people a chance to even think about, well, wait, was complaint 7 even true? Just give a long list, right? And then I don't bother giving any numbers. Numbers just bore people. Just complain as much as possible. I think another one was turn every positive into a negative, right? So yes. If there's a group, if there's a group that is frugal, call them cheap, right? If there's a group that is hardworking, say, oh, they're just helots. I feel like when debating immigration with people, like one thing people say, oh, they're all on welfare, they're lazy. Actually, illegal immigrants have the highest rate of labor force participation of any known demographic. It's like, oh, well, that's because they're a bunch of helots. Like all they do is work, and they're not human, they're robots.
Normal Americans can't compete with these people, Brian.
Yeah. How are we supposed to have a job with someone who they're happy to work 70 hours a week? It's like, wait, 20 seconds ago you were saying that they're lazy. Now you're saying they work 70 hours a week. It's like, look, consistency is not important. Just unleash your gut of anger, and just when you maintain the floor, it's sort of like a filibuster. Right.
Yeah, scope. It seems like scope is not important. It's what's the cognitive bias where the availability heuristic. As long as you can come up with a decent quick list of bad things, that matters a lot more than the details or the scope of how bad
Yes,
they are.
there's actually a more specific psychological concept. Throwing a blank on it. Basically, there's these experiments where they ask people about their willingness to save like 1,000,000 seagulls or 1,000,000,000 seagulls, and the
Scope
willingness
and
to pay is
sensitivity.
scope and sensitivity, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is a big part of demonizing a group. Like, it doesn't really matter what the numbers are. Just tap into one negative emotion after another, and just try to turn the crank, keep people at a level of constant rage. I mean, you can really see this if you go to the websites for anti-immigration think tanks, and you just see like every day it's just another 10 horrible stories about immigrants. They could be everything from, new study says that they are costing us, $1 trillion a year, to one immigrant hit someone else with his car and then the person lost his foot. Like it could just be like anything at all. Just 10 negative stories about immigrants, regardless of their severity, regardless of whether they're on point. Just keep the anger flowing. This is what you do if you want to demonize someone or some group.
That's great bad advice. Do you have a favorite essay in this collection?
That Monopolize the Pretty Lies might be it, but it's hard to choose among your children.
I really liked the banality of Leninism.
Oh, yes. Banality of Leninism. Yes, that one was a lot of fun. So, Vladimir Lenin, first dictator of the Soviet Union. So many people, consider him to be just a great intellectual. I'll say, well, look, but then most things say, hey, he's not really a great intellectual, but he is a great theorist of how to actually gain power in Marxism and just the general strategy of revolution. What I say is, look, he's not even very original there, because the central ideas of let's go and fight a blood-soaked revolution in order to gain power and fix the world, those are actually so well established in the Russian revolutionary tradition. So I have a bunch of quotes from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment from decades before Lenin's birth. Right. And in these, there's Raskolnikov is talking to who's the anti-hero of the story. He's the one who murders the old woman with an axe in order to prove that he's not bound by normal moral law. But anyway, after the murder, he's talking to a cop and sharing his philosophy. And when you read it, it comes down to this long belaboring of, look, if you go and save 1 billion people by hacking up one woman with an axe, you'd do it, right? And lovingly detailing this, like how I believe that a great man would pick up that axe and hack away. It would be so good. And who are we to judge such a man who would go and murder a so-called innocent old woman when there's the great fate of humanity at stake? And then there's almost nothing establishing there's any causal connection between murdering this poor woman with an axe and helping the world at all. So, it's very much part of this Russian revolutionary tradition to glorify violence in the name of the greater betterment of society, but with almost no attention paid to whether, in fact, the violence is making things better at all, much less whether it justifies the horrible things that you're doing.
This is another example of something you've talked about. I don't recall if it's in this collection or not, but and another cognitive bias where you're substituting an easier question for a harder question and answering that. Like it's relatively easy question to answer. Is there ever a conceivable circumstance when you might be morally justified to murder an innocent person? And sure, you can come up with 1 million implausible scenarios and maybe scour the world for a real historical scenario. But these scenarios don't just come up all the time, and the people who bring it up are probably saying it because they're about to do something horrible.
Yeah, they're sociopaths. So I say, the philosophy that Lenin embraces morally was really just the same as utilitarianism. It's very much like what John Stuart Mill taught, but there's one difference. They say, a normal utilitarian, when they go through all the math and it turns out that that it's justified or morally required to go and murder a person, they check their work. Right? There's well, do we really have to do this? Is there some other way? Isn't there a more humane way? And they go over the math multiple times. And they say, gee, we really don't want to just go and murder this poor innocent woman. Isn't there something else we could possibly do? And then if at the end, after a lot of intellectual scrutiny, it turns out, no, gee, it's all right, Cal, I guess we have to do it. Whereas someone like Lenin goes from the mere possibility, and then as soon as they get to the answer of mass murder, then it's more like, woohoo, that's what we wanted to do in the first place.
There's probably already some enemies that he felt needed to be mass murdered.
Isn't it great? It turns out the best way to help society is to murder everyone that we don't like and to put ourselves in charge as dictators for life. Oh, what a interesting coincidence. So while Lenin, I would put him in the utilitarian camp, but I would not tar all utilitarians by any means with being like him. So like a normal utilitarian is a quantitative person who doesn't want to do bad things, and then occasionally will say, oh God, like it looks like we have to. Whereas people in this Marxist-Leninist tradition, which is of course a much more intellectually influential intellectual tradition than utilitarianism ever was historically, they, on the other hand, are these really sociopaths who start with utilitarian philosophy, but really are working backwards from that to committing mass murder.
Might not even be looking at the murder part as a cost.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah. So one of the early Bolsheviks, Zinoviev, had a public speech where he said, we're going to say, we're going to this is going to be great for, I don't remember, 150 million Russians, 20 million 20 million others are going to have to perish. All, and I think his quote was something like, what do we have to say to those 20 million? Too bad for you.
Yeah. Another point against Lenin as a theorist, as a brilliant theorist, is he's not even the socialist who really spearheaded the idea of a vanguard party as opposed to the mass of the working people. I think that was a French socialist named Blanqui. That's what he's often very famous for.
So in Russia, there was a previous guy named Nechayev who probably did have a lot of covert influence on Lenin, although I don't think Lenin acknowledged it. But yes, so there was him. In terms of Lenin's reading, so definitely, of course, there's the Russian tradition, but also German socialism probably would have more influence. As to whether how much he really knew about the French socialists, probably a little bit, but not just so. I'm hazy on how much he knew about.
I feel like I read at one point that he denied any connection there, or that he denied he was a Blanquiist or something, because he's a very important man. He did it all himself.
Lenin definitely gave Marx credit for the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and would have, I think, appropriately argued that the vanguard party is the natural implication of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Of course.
Yes.
It just have to read between the lines.
He was a loyal Marxist. Whatever else he was that.
It's probably easier to be loyal to someone who's dead if you're a demagogue.
Very good. Very true, Chris.
Not too many orders to take, and you can kind of read between the lines if you need to. The common sense case for pacifism is a few essays I recall reading over my life that hit me like a ton of bricks, and that was one of them. I don't know if I read it exactly when you wrote it, which was like 12 years ago, but I was glad to see it in here again. I think it's very powerful. Can you say, one, what you mean by pacifism and why you're in favor of letting the Huns invade our land, and what's the common sense case for pacifism?
There's absolute pacifism, which says I would not use violence even in self-defense, which is not my view at all. Then there is the other meaning of pacifism, is this opposition to war, which I do embrace, right, as a strong moral presumption, not as an absolute rule, but as a strong moral presumption. And the argument goes like this. First premise: modern wars are never actually defensive wars. Modern wars, due to the technology, almost always involve either deliberate mass murder of innocent people, or at least negligent manslaughter of innocent people on the other side. So there's deliberately firebombing a city, murder, and then there is just dropping a nuclear weapon on a military base, which is actually going to kill a vastly larger number of innocent people. That would probably get classified as manslaughter if you were doing it in court. So second premise is that while these short-run costs of war, of actually going, especially of murdering and manslaughtering innocent people, the short-run costs are very clear. But on the other hand, the long-run benefits of war, the improvement of the state of the world that people think justifies those short-run costs, are actually, in fact, highly uncertain. right? And here I do draw upon this empirical evidence from people like Philip Tetlock on how even experts are very bad at forecasting the effects of war. And, and I always tell people, if you doubt this, let's go and bet. Let's go and bet. Let's get a specific bet on exactly what will happen if we invade a country, and we will see what happens. And also give me, I want odds, because if you think you really know, all I'm saying is that it's uncertain. If you to disagree with me, you have to say, no, it is highly certain. In that case, I deserve to receive favorable odds in the bet. And then the last premise is what philosophers sometimes call the forced organ donation hypothetical. It's just a simple moral hypothetical that goes like this. You are a doctor. You have 5 patients. Each patient requires a different organ transplant. One needs a new set of lungs. One needs a heart. One needs 2 new kidneys, right? And so on. One needs a liver. All right. So you have 5 people that are going to die unless they get an organ. And then who walks by? A perfectly healthy guy with no family, no friends. All right. Is it morally all right to go and murder him to save those 5 people? Right. Almost everyone says no, which I take to mean that while it might not be absolute, if it's 1 million people, all right, maybe, but 5 is not enough. So I say that there's this moral premise that before you go and start murdering or manslaughtering innocent people, it's not necessary just that there is an excess of benefits over costs. You have to have high confidence that there's a large excess of benefits over costs, right? You snap all these premises together, and I say this adds up to a very strong presumption in favor of pacifism, of not fighting wars, of avoiding wars, and yes, and saying, look, is there some way that we can avoid this so that we don't start going and murdering or manslaughtering innocent people? So that's the heart of it. And again, the quicker version is just to say, look, the short-run costs of war are very clear, very large. The long-run benefits are highly uncertain. And in order for war to be justified, you would have to know with confidence that the long-run benefits greatly exceeded the short-run costs. And we almost never have that knowledge.
That's a great and succinct way of putting it. So your common sense case for pacifism, you acknowledge the possibility that some wars might in fact have long-term benefits that justify the cost. And you give us plausible examples, the Napoleonic Wars and World War II. Even there, I sense maybe some hesitance. I've always... I'm
trying to remember, did I say World War II or the Korean War? I think I said the Korean War.
Did you not say World War II?
Yes, I don't think I did say World War II, because I think that's much more up in the air.
I do too, and that's going to take away from what I'll say it anyways. Imagining how bad things could have been needs to be weighed against the obvious consequences of World War II in terms of communist China and Soviet deaths that almost certainly wouldn't have happened but for the particular way World War II played out. But it sounds like you're not disputing that, or I don't know if you'd put it a different way.
I mean, we can still go over it if you want.
You said the Korean War and possibly the Napoleonic Wars might count as plausible candidates for wars that had long-run benefits that would justify the cost.
The defeat of Napoleon specifically, the Napoleonic Wars includes all the horrible stuff that led up to that.
Yes.
Yes, Napoleon is really what's crucial.
But World War II is ambiguous enough. Can you say something about that?
It's important to understand just how bad the World War II turned out. So, not only was half of Europe under Stalinist tyranny, but at least there you could say, well, half wasn't. So that's a big improvement. But the other big consequence of World War II was that the communists took over China. Very unlikely that they would have done so if not for the defeat of the Japanese in the Eastern Theater. Right. And if you compare the horrible way the Japanese ruled their territories to the unimaginably horrible way the communist Chinese ruled their territories, I think there's very little doubt that it would have been better if the Japanese had won over the communists. Chiang Kai-shek was horrible as well, but anyone but the communists would have been preferable. And again, that's not just one country; that is the largest country on earth. So, in terms of the actual outcome for humanity of World War II, like you really do have to remember how bad things turned out in the Eastern Theater. The outcome, could have been even worse than that. In 1945, if you had asked people to guess, well, when's World War III going to happen? I think a lot of people would have said in the next 10 years. It's kind of amazing that World War III didn't happen. See, that's sort of the one redeeming grace of the end of World War II is that so far, mind you, we've avoided World War III. since I was just in Poland, definitely a little bit, yeah, maybe World War III is coming. I think it's unlikely, but to say it's unlikely rather than just super unlikely is the kind of thing that's pretty terrifying, especially when you listen to the demagogues that are in power and hear what they have to say. There was just an interview with the U.S. Secretary of Defense where he was asked, well, aren't you worried that this could provoke Russia into nuclear war? He said, well, it's important to remember the United States also has nuclear weapons. So, they have to be afraid of our deterrent. Like, I didn't know that we had nuclear weapons. Oh, so I guess we can really just sleep well at night and stop worrying, knowing that we have a nuclear deterrent. Of course. Thank you so much for clearing all that up. Right? I mean, it's just like, it's such an asinine thing to say. It's as if Dr. Strangelove had never been filmed or something like that.
Watched that movie again recently, and it's more relevant feeling than ever.
I mean, the idea that, like, to me, what's amazing about Dr. Strangelove is they put this in movie theaters and people laughed at the time. It's like right around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you think it's like, this hits too close to home.
It was not intended to be a comedy, and partway through filming, Kubrick decided he changed it to be a black comedy rather than a drama. Arguably,
it's George C. Scott's very best role. Probably Patton's better, but that's definitely a strong number two in any case.
Absolutely. Go on. You were talking about the consequences of World War II and just how bad it was, despite its reputation as the good war.
Right. So yeah. So I mean, again, like, I'm not saying that it couldn't have been worse if, for example, the U.S. had stayed out of World War II, or if Britain had made a separate peace with Hitler in 1940. What I'm saying is that it's highly uncertain that the actual outcome was better. And then, per my common sense case for pacifism, it's not enough to go and fight and wage a bloody war just because you think that maybe this will make things better. You've got to do better than that, or if you're going to go and fight a modern war where you're murdering really millions of innocent people.
And another piece of that story is, one, somebody might object that, well, almost any cost had to be borne to stop the Holocaust. It's common knowledge among people in the know that never was the intent of what we did, and we didn't, and it wasn't fully stopped, and opportunities were there to mitigate it that weren't taken. And I think there's a growing consensus among historians that was not his first choice, and that the war virtually guaranteed the acceleration of the final solution. He was never planning on doing anything kind with German Jews, but...
Well, I mean, of course, it's not mostly German Jews. It's Eastern European Jews that are the primary victims of the Holocaust. There weren't very many German Jews. I think there were only 2% of the population of Germany.
Yeah, that's right.
At least before Germany's borders expanded to Austria. I think that probably gave them a large number. And the main thing to understand is, there's horrible mass murder in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet bloc countries, but especially in China. The multiple mass murders that happened in communist China, estimates of those death tolls easily come out to 10 times what the Holocaust was. So, if you really think that a world war was justified to stop the Holocaust, then, well, World War III seems like it would have been justified to have stopped the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, as well as multiple other mass murders that went on under Mao's rule. You even remember like when I was in maybe junior high, we were given this reading about the communists showing up at some village in China and saying, "Hand over your money lenders and landlords," and then the whole village goes and then there's a public execution where they go and denounce them. And then just to realize, well, so these money lenders and landlords, they were a couple percent of the population of China. And all over China, Mao sent out quotas. Every village, let's go and execute a certain percentage of the people there as landlords and money lenders. And you multiply that percent by the population of China, and you just, oh my God, that by itself, we're talking about 6 million people at least.
I didn't know that specific part.
Right. And it's like, and even in the U.S., the tone of this piece is, well, it might seem harsh, but they were money lenders and landlords after all.
After all, they lent money, Brian.
Yes. And it's like, look, so this kid's dad is a banker. Can we go murder his dad? Is that okay? Brian's dad owns a rental property. Can we go and murder Brian's dad for having a rental property? So just the way that even in the U.S. people would go and accept these absurd rationales for mass murder really was stunning to me. Well, not at the time, but... In hindsight, it was stunning to me.
Let's stay with World War II. So you have another essay where you talk about Hitler's stated reasons for invading countries and how he briefly considered alternatives to war and invasion, but swept them away as out of hand, probably because considering them in the first place was never really sincere. Can you talk about what his motivations were and what alternatives he considered and dismissed?
I wouldn't even so much call him insincere as just impatient. But so here's the thing. All right, Hitler invaded a whole lot of countries, right? And why? Well, what was the argument? Like there was an argument, and actually there was. So there's a chapter in Mein Kampf where he explains why it is that he's going to go and invade other countries, and these specific ones that he's going to invade. Right, it all starts off with a Malthusian premise. Germany does not have enough land to feed its people, which is itself inspired by the economic blockade of Germany in the last phase of World War I, as well as actually for a considerable time after the armistice, where food has been cut off from Germany, and they actually had a quite severe famine. Right, so Hitler is talking to an audience that remembers this horrible famine at the end of the war, and he's saying, "Look, Germany obviously doesn't have enough food in order to feed its people. So what are we going to do? What are we going to do?" And then he says, "Okay, well, there's a few options. One is to improve our agricultural productivity." And he says, "All right, well, that can be done within some modest limits, but it's not realistic for that to actually be our solution." He says, "All right, then we could go and specialize in manufacturing goods and then trade those to other countries in order to go and get food." And he says, "No, that's not very realistic either. This trade, it's not going to work out." He says, "Then we could limit our numbers. Right, we could use birth control and that kind of thing." And he says, no, that's not going to work, because the country that limits its numbers has a smaller population. The country with a smaller population is just going to be bullied or conquered by neighboring countries with larger populations. So no go. Because then we could go and get foreign colonies. And he says, no, but there's two problems with foreign colonies. First of all, the climate is not good for Germans. Right. And second of all, he says that all potential colonies are now currently, or like virtually all foreign, desirable foreign territories are already controlled by some European country. So in order to get them, you would have to go and attack a European country anyway. He says, so therefore, why not go and cut out the middleman and just attack European countries directly and seize their territory right here, right now? We like the climate; it's close by. And that's, of course, exactly what he did. Let's go and attack the East. Let's go and grab their land, enslave them, or murder them, or expel them, and then we'll farm that land, and that's how we'll get our food. And so, Hitler said all this in Mein Kampf, which really, actually, as it turns out, did very closely predict what he did. There were a lot of people who, for years, saying, "Well, this is just like his ravings for his fanatical followers." Like, no, he is the leader of the fanatics. He is chief fanatic, or was chief fanatic. And again, I say, and then the last thing I say is the irony of all of this is that the end of World War II meant that you had even less land. Germany lost a lot of land. I think actually their population density went up because there were so many ethnic Germans that got expelled from all over Eastern Europe, especially, and wind up settling in the new, much smaller Germany. And then what happened, particularly to West Germany? Right. Well, how did we have West Germany? Were there any serious problems with hunger for West Germany after, after the 1948? Anyway, there's a few terrible years, of course, at the very end of the war. No, actually, of course, Germans are having no trouble at all with getting food. And how do they do it? Well, by doing the two things that Hitler said couldn't be done: by increasing agricultural productivity and by international trade. So the two things that he dismissed as being pie in the sky, unrealistic, were actually the only realistic path. They totally worked. And on the other hand, let's go and start a World War II in order to go and seize territory. That turned out to be the cockamamie, ridiculous plan that he acted like was so realistic and hard-headed, and was not, as we all know now.
Well, commerce is wimpy and war is the fountain of all good things. And
standard demagogic thinking, like the glory of war, the wonder of war. Dulce et decorum est. Right, famous poem. Sweet and glorious it is to die for your country.
I was talking with John Mueller, the author of The Stupidity of War, and one of the things he documents in that book is how ubiquitous and easy it was prior to World War I to find people talking about the glories of war and how purifying it is and cleansing and great and all this stuff. And how after World War I, it becomes virtually impossible. And prior to then, it wasn't just Prussian militarist types.
I'm surprised you say that. Don't you mean after World War II?
No.
Of course, there's a lot of people talking about how great war was in the interwar period, starting with Hitler.
That was surprising to me. So talking to him, his claim was that after World War I, essentially nobody wanted war except for Hitler. And that he was a very successful, and I don't know if he's right about that. I'm taking him at his word. He wrote the book, but that
I can believe that there's a big increase in the variance, and there are more people saying war is terrible after World War I. But you also have a very strong chunk of people saying, no, we got it right the first time. Starting with Hitler, most obviously, but. Soviet Union, there's an enormous amount of glorification of war in the Soviet Union. You can go and watch Soviet movies from the 30s to see how, Alexander Nevsky, for example, or Ivan the Terrible. These are the famous Eisenstein movies that Stalin greenlit, right? And you watch those, and great glorification of war there. Of course, Italian fascism, lots of glorification of war. So I'm puzzled by that Mueller would say that.
I'll look into maybe what the specifics of the claim was. It might have been more limited than what I just said.
To say that no one in Japan talked about the glory of war in between the interwar period, no way.
All these
whole ideology.
Counter examples sound obvious.
Every colonial liberation movement glorifies war, of course. Every colonial quote unquote liberation movement has to glorify war because Frantz Fanon.
Civil war or international war?
Well, we don't need to be all that specific, do we?
Not that there's a big moral difference. I think his thesis was specific to international war and maybe to Western Europe.
I mean, here's the thing about a colonial liberation movement. To outsiders, it's a civil war. But to insiders, it's an international war because Algeria is already a separate country from France. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Have you ever read, since he wrote a lot about World War II in this, have you read A.J.P. Taylor's Origins of the Second World War, or have any thoughts on his heterodoxy?
I did read that about 20 years ago. My final view of that book is that it is sort of a fairly ridiculous apology for Hitler. I know that there's a lot of people who seemingly unfairly tarred him with that, but ultimately I think that it's not that Hitler really does stand out as being an unusually warmongering political leader by the standards of any time. Right? And the pretext that on which he fights wars are so flimsy compared even to what was done in earlier decades. And for Taylor to try to assimilate him and say, no, he was just like a regular, strong national leader of a kind that was accepted for decades. I think Taylor made a big mistake there.
I had read that he never read Mein Kampf writing the book.
Hard to believe.
It is hard to believe because he's not a fringe historian.
No, not at all. So I very much doubt that he didn't read it. I think he was probably more among the people who just said, well, this is just the Bible written for his inter-party fanatics. He doesn't really believe it himself. But then once you know that the Holocaust happened, you say, it doesn't seem like it was. It seems like he was the chief fanatic. Of course. I mean, especially I do think that it's true that there are many people in high up in the Nazi Party who wanted to at minimum take a breather after they managed to get Czechoslovakia, right, or really just declare victory and say, look, we got what we wanted. We don't want to push our luck here. Very, very striking. So, at the very beginning of World War II, seems that Berlin was supposed to be eerily quiet. Even Germans are like, okay, gee, everything's going so well, and now we're going to go and actually fight a major war and see what happens. Why? For whom? So yeah, I think this was a case where Hitler was well ahead of most of even his more fanatical followers in being the chief warmonger.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I don't feel like I'm competent to judge it. I read The Origins of the Second World War some years ago too. Feel puzzled as to how to think about it. What you said sounds right to me, which is more in line with the consensus that Mein Kampf really does come true, more or less, or at least efforts to make it come true.
Right. And again, just the like if you know the like there were some major orders that were not entirely followed or they were changed. But the original German war plan was just to take away the food of the population of Eastern Europe and starve them to death, figuring that, well, who needs them anyway? But we're going to win this war in a year. And the decision to actually even issue rations to the populations of the conquered territories really comes down to, oh, the war's going to last too long, longer than we thought. So I guess we need them alive. Right. And to have actual documents of here's our war plan. We take all the food away from the population of the countries we're conquering. Like to have that, it's like, oh my God, like what kind of homicidal maniacs are running this country? It's like, yeah, well, they're the Nazis. They're called the Nazis, dude.
So, and there's another example. You were talking about Lenin's crude and hasty utilitarianism, where it sounds like, and I think you quote Himmler, it sounds like they're not even considered that the debts of these people are not even on the cost side of the ledger. This is
yes.
This is just some more work to be done, except insofar as it's a burden to the Germans who have to kill them.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, the poor Germans. We're sensitive people. We don't want to have to murder these people. Why do they have to be there, rudely breathing air? If they just had the decency to never been born, then we wouldn't have to have this blood on our hands. The jerks. That's the flavor of Heinrich Himmler.
Can you talk a little bit about the essay you have where you compare you're asking about the relevant moral distinctions between the My Lai massacre and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you list some plausible candidates and find them coming up wanting?
Yes, so probably everyone listening is familiar with the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you know the arguments that people give in their favor, saying, well, saved a lot of American lives by doing it. Sure, we went and murdered a whole bunch of people. There is the story which many people have of like, well, they're not really innocent. The Japanese weren't innocent because it's their fault. There was the war. It's like, well, the guy who cleaned the toilets in Japan, he was responsible for World War II. He was part of the planning. Or again, if you're going to blame him, right, how about that guy's baby? The guy's baby is to blame for the attack on Pearl Harbor. That doesn't make any sense. If there was a serial killer with a baby, would you go and put the baby in the gas chamber with him and say, yeah, well, you should have figured out some way of stopping your dad from killing all those people, kid? Right? Pretty crazy. All right. So anyway, this is the background. Now, the My Lai massacre, this is one of the most famous American war crimes in Vietnam. You can get a good version of it in Mike Humer's The Problem of Political Authority. But basically, it seems like order was given to go and massacre every living person in this village in Vietnam, right? And then there was actually one heroic American who went and saved some of the people and then reported what happened to the world. And so this is how people found out about it, right? But anyway, the kinds of things that you might say is, well, look, was this justified? Almost everyone wants to say that My Lai was not justified. And it's like, well, why did you kill all those people? Well, there were guerrillas that were mingled among the population. So the only way to be sure you were killing all the guerrillas was to kill everybody there. And it's like, all right. All right. So then you get to kill an entire population. And then there's, well, what about killing the babies? Well, let's say, the whole village is guilty for this. They brought this on themselves. So we're going to have to go and do this. And then, of course, you could just say, well, the difference was that Hiroshima and Nagasaki really did end World War II, and My Lai did not end the Vietnam War. And to that I say, well, suppose we could have just done 1,000 My Lai massacres, and that would have ended the war. Or then would it have been okay? At minimum, it's a tough call. It's a tough call. I think almost anyone would really have to say, we go and we just murder 1,000 villages in Vietnam, and then we get victory out of that. Is that morally acceptable to do? Right. But really, I say that the arguments for the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki really are very similar to those.
I think I had read that North Vietnam, though, specifically is maybe unique in military history for the level of casualties it was willing to tolerate without losing soldier morale. Perhaps My Lai all the way through wouldn't have done it anyway.
Well, of course, there's also the slave labor camp, or worse, for anyone that doesn't go along with it. So,
But somebody's got to
like,
enforce those slave labor camps.
Yes. Well, I mean, like this is classic vanguard party stuff. You have a tiny core of fanatics who then have their guns pointed at a broader core of semi-fanatics who have their guns pointed at a often apathetic population, right? Just to understand what's really going on. It's and the vanguard parties are very good at turning a very small number of fanatics into total control over a country. That's, you give them credit. So they've got a lot of success along those lines.
Would you ever consider writing an original book rather than a collection related to war or foreign policy?
A few books down my queue of books. There's one called, I believe the title of the book is Pragmatic Pacifism.
Pragmatic pacifism is one of the sections in this book, right?
Yes. So I believe that is the planned title of a book on basically fleshing out this common sense case for pacifism to book length. So based upon the current queue, maybe 10 years from now, I could be working on that book.
It's worth the wait.
So that definitely is one that I am that is on the agenda. I think I do have something unusual to say about it. My long-run plan is to do that. Absolutely.
What is the next essay collection that you have planned? I know you're in you just mentioned your queue, and I know you've got a ton of books waiting to be published, but what's the next collection of blog posts to be published?
Essays, Chris. Essays. Essays sounds much better than posts. All right. All right. So there are two that are going right now, but probably the one that's going to come out first is called Don't Be a Feminist, Essays on Genuine Justice. This is actually the only one of these books that will feature a totally new essay, which is the title essay of the book is Don't Be a Feminist, a Letter to My Daughter. I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, and I blogged it a little bit, but I really wanted to get my thoughts all down in one place. And again, the way that I describe it, my daughter is only 10, so she's actually too young to read the essay. But what I say in the essay is I want the essay to be ready for her the day she asks. So I want it to be on tap.
Another provocative title. It's been said that feminism is the radical idea that women are people, so I take it you're going to be arguing the contrary in this book.
Right. I mean, I say that's a lot like calling your newspaper Pravda.
Yeah.
It's the newspaper's truth. Are you against truth? No? Well, then you must support Pravda, whatever we say. So the essay starts with, well, what is feminism anyway? Well, there's some interesting public opinion work on this. And now the public opinion does not actually ask the question, are women people? But it does have the question, should women be treated equally socially, economically, and politically? And about 95% of non-feminists say yes, which says that it is not actually a view distinctive to feminism that men and women should be treated equally. This is actually a view held by almost everybody in the United States and probably almost every Western society. So therefore, it is just ridiculous propaganda to claim that this is what distinguishes feminism from other views. It's like saying feminism is theory the sky is blue. Right? Look, I believe that you believe the sky is blue, but guess what? The people that you don't like also believe the sky is blue. So why don't you stop libeling people that you disagree with and actually say what really distinguishes your view from that of other people? So what I suggest a much better definition of feminism is the view that society treats women less fairly than men. It's the view that society treats women less fairly than men. And I say this is actually a view that distinguishes feminists from non-feminists, because if you ask feminists, does society treat women less fairly than men? I am confident you will get at least 90%, probably more like 98% saying, yes, of course. How could you even ask that? And on the other hand, if you go to your non-feminists, I'd ask them, does society treat women less fairly than men? This is where people who say that they are not feminists are either going to say no, or it's like, it's complicated. I don't know, maybe. All right, so I say that is really the distinguishing idea of feminism, is that our society treats women less fairly than men. And then what I do in this essay is say, well, is that actually true? So I go and I list all of the standard feminist complaints about how women are treated poorly, how women make less money than men, about women are given an unfair, or are given most of the responsibility for housework and childcare. Go through, I list all of those. And I say, all right, so we have all those. Now let's go and make a list of all the ways that you might think the society treats men less fairly than women. And there's also a very standard list here. Everything from, men are much more likely to be the victims of violent crime. Men are the only ones that get conscripted. Men receive poor treatment in custody cases. Men do almost all of the really hard and dirty jobs in every known society. Men are at least 90% of all the workplace fatalities, right? So you go through all of those. And you say, now we've got two lists. We have a list of all the ways that women are treated, or at least possibly treated less fairly than men, but we also have a list of all the ways that men are treated less fairly than women. At this point, it's like, well, at least it's no longer all that obvious that our society treats women less fairly than men overall. But then I say that, just coming up with a list isn't adequate. You've got to consider the possibility that the differences are not driven by unfairness, but by actual changes in behavior or performance of the different genders. So it's pretty obvious in the case of men. You can say that over 90% of all the people in jail are men. It's like, well, is that just because society woke up on the wrong side of the bed one day and said, I hate men, let's put a lot of them in prison, right? Or is it rather that men commit a lot more crime? And yeah, obviously the second story makes a whole lot more sense. There may be some marginal unfairness towards males in the criminal justice system, but overwhelmingly the reason why men are so imprisoned is because of worse male behavior, right? And I think almost any person could agree that is true. And I say, well, how about on the side of alleged unfairness against women? Is there any way to explain these without reference to unfairness? So as an economist, I spent a lot of time focusing on differences in income and career success. And there I say, yes, there's actually excellent explanations for why women generally earn less money than men that have nothing to do with unfairness, that rather are about things like women are much less likely to do STEM. Women are much less interested in quantitative fields of higher productivity. So yes, they make less money because they are choosing to study fields that they know are less lucrative because they are less productive for society, right? And that isn't to criticize them, but to say, well, look, if you make a choice to do something that is more rewarding for you, that is less helpful for society, then of course you're going to make less money. And it's not reasonable to go and say that society is being unfair to you because of that, right? And then the rest of the essay just spends a lot of time going over this list and considering explanations other than unfairness for what's going on. And then at the end, I say, all right, so we do have some cases where, I don't think that there is a good such explanation, but then in terms of where the balance lies, I say really what's in my mind, tips the scale most is just the degree of unfair accusations against men as being very unfair. I say, look, without those accusations, then at least it's a close call about which gender is treated more unfairly by society. But when you realize that we do live in a society where it is totally acceptable for women to very loudly make sweeping collective complaints against men, and where it is not acceptable for men to publicly do that about women, that I say is what really tips the scale and says feminism is actually false. Our society actually does treat men less fairly than women overall. So the piece also says, look, there's some other societies that are different. So I said in Saudi Arabia, I would be a feminist. Saudi Arabia really does treat women less fairly than men. I think the case is very strong. But what does that have to do with our society?
Well, I will certainly reach out to you and harass you to talk about that book when it comes out.
Right. By the way, the subtitle, Essays on Genuine Justice, this is genuine justice as opposed to social justice. So most of the essays in this book have something, some connection to what people call the social justice or woke movement. So there's an essay on what I call the uniformity and exclusion movement, because I say, contrary to the official propaganda, the woke movement is not really about diversity or inclusion. It is about uniformity and exclusion, combined with intimidation to make sure that people don't go and point out this obvious fact.
And a serious lack of humility. On a purely stylistic level, that's an element of social justice activism that always has rubbed me the wrong way, is just extreme arrogance.
Honestly, whenever people mention lack of humility, I always have a joke where I just, well, you can't blame someone for that. I mean, I would fault much more for lack of a sense of humor. I can handle arrogance as long as it's arrogance with a good sense of humor. But yes, the humorless person. This is the person that
if you can be self-deprecating while you're arrogant, yeah, I agree.
Any person good enough to be arrogant is good enough to self-deprecate with great aplomb.
So for this book, How Evil Are Politicians. Do you have any book recommendations that you think would complement this book very well?
First of all, there are two great books by political psychologist Phil Tetlock. So there's his Expert Political Judgment, How Good Is It? How Can We Know? And there's also Super Forecasting. So I think those are two great books just for understanding the contrast between actual objective thinking about politics versus the power-hungry production of lies to gain power. So those are, in a way, those are some of the best at the meta level for just understanding where I'm coming from.
They're really good. I've read both of those books, and I think on your recommendation sometime years ago.
Let's see, there's a great book by Stanley Payne called History of Fascism that really goes over international fascism. Of course, it does Nazism, Italian fascism, but it gives a good review of copycat movements all over the world, just to understand what these are about. There's also, there's so many great books about the history of communism. An old one, so some of the facts are going to be out of date, or now we've got archives, so we'll see that he wasn't right about everything. But still, a book that I like very much is one called World Communism by Franz Borkenau. Another one that's very fun. The authenticity of this book is disputed, but there was a dissident Nazi who left the party named Hermann Rauschning. I think he was the head of the Danzig party. And he wrote a whole book what he claimed was his personal conversations with Hitler. I think it's just called Hitler Speaks. The book's called Hitler Speaks. There are some people say Rauschning made it up. I don't know. The book, to me, it just rings so true. And it's well, how do they know he made it up? Right? There's the famous Roman historian Suetonius. A lot of people say he made it up. And I'm how do you know he made it up? I don't know. Sounds pretty good to me. All right, I guess he probably wasn't there while Tiberius torture children, but just go and say that it was a fabrication seems kind of unfair. At least you'll say, I don't know, maybe. Those are all good just for understanding demagoguery. I mean, honestly, if you really want to understand the mind of a demagogue, Mein Kampf is a very interesting read. So people will take this out of context and say, Bryan Caplan is praising Mein Kampf. It's very interesting for historical understanding and just to realize that just because it's an evil book doesn't mean you can't learn a lot from it. You can.
Well, I'll put all of these on the show notes page, possibly accepting Mein Kampf. Maybe I'll write it, but not link to it. I don't know. Let's see how much controversy I want to court.
The mind of a monster, put it that way.
The mind of a monster, to be clear. Can you say where people can find you if they want to follow what you're up to?
So they can buy the book on Amazon. It's just $12 for the paperback, $9.99 for the ebook. And then I blog for Bet On It on Substack.
Last time you were on, and you are my first returning guest, it was just prior to you making your switch to Substack. I understand that's gone very well. I'll also link to your blog and your Twitter and to How Evil Are Politicians so that people can buy that as well.
Always a great pleasure, Chris. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Bryan. Enjoy your morning. Enjoy your time in Italy. That was Bryan Caplan, and his new book is How Evil Are Politicians? Essays in Demagoguery. You can purchase that book on Amazon, and you can also find links to that book, as well as other topics discussed in today's episode on the show notes. If you're enjoying what I do here, please subscribe to Ideas Having Sex with Chris Kaufman on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And please rate and review the show. It only takes a second, but it helps out tremendously. I'm Chris Kaufman. Thanks for listening.